Hi, sir. We will be presenting on the phytoplanktons. My group members are Ms. Nareli Bolaños, Mr. Dennis Gladden, Mr. Terrell Sabal, and myself, Nerissa Eligio. Next. So the learning objectives. We will help you to understand phytoplanktons and their importance in an ecosystem. Next, we will classify the phytoplanktons by their size, habitat, and their identification. We will also include an example of a phytoplankton food web, stating its primary, secondary, and tertiary consumers, as well as a decomposer. Next, we will describe the biotic and abiotic components of their ecosystems. Also describe the human impacts that affect their ecosystem, each with a suggested solution. And lastly, we will show data. Next. Here is a quote by Jacques Cousteau to start off our presentation. About 2/3 of the oxygen in our atmosphere is produced in the surface waters of the sea by phytoplanktons. The minute forms algae that give the sea slightly green hue, and which initiate the ocean food web of the ocean. Next. Here's the introduction.
Hi, sir. I will be doing the introduction. So what is planktons? Plankton is a word in Greek, which means drifter or wanderer. Planktons are not able to swim, so they basically when it comes to movement, they depend on the wind and the tides. So what are phytoplanktons? They are microalgae of the ocean. They are quite similar to terrestrial plants in the way that they possess chlorophyll and need sunlight to grow and survive. In most marine species, they are the backbone of the food chain. Likewise, as in terrestrial, the plants are the backbone of our food chain. And when it comes to the ocean and the marine life, phytoplanktons are the backbone of the food chain. So they account for half of this photosynthetic activity in the planet. And they are fundamental, that makes them fundamental for our ecosystem due to the fact that with the process of photosynthesis, the ocean produces oxygen, as the end product. Abiotic factors. So abiotic factors of planktons are tides, which they use for movement, temperature, which affects their growth, light, which they need, likewise as plants, they need light in order to photosynthesize, and phytoplanktons need light to photosynthesize, nutrients, concentration, and then there is the biotic factors. In the phytoplanktons case, it would be the zooplankton. So zooplanktons are unable to create their own food like phytoplanktons. So that is why they eat and they rely on eating specifically phytoplanktons. Just like in terrestrial, the grass is the phytoplankton, for example, and then the rabbit would be an animal version of the zooplankton in the marine life food web. So taxonomic group. So there's 8 phytoplankton taxonomic groups. There's the Cyanophyta, the Chlorophyta, the Eugranophyta, the diatoms, the coccolithophores, Cryptophyta, Parsinophytes, and dinoflagellates. Taxonomy group of diatoms and Eugranophyta. So we found the taxonomy for 2 groups, which is the diatom and the Eugranophyta. The kingdom for diatoms is the Chromista, and for the Eugranophyta is the Protozoa. The phylum for diatoms is Heterocont, meanwhile for Eugranophyta is Eugranophycota. The class for diatoms would be Basilorophyceae, meanwhile for the Eugranophyta would be Euglenophyceae. The order for diatoms is Pennials, meanwhile for the Euglenophyta is Euglanales. The order and the genus were not found for the diatoms, but they were found for the Euglenophyta, which is the Euglenia, and the Euglanales Ehrenberg. So classification by size. There is the megaplankton, which is more than 20 cm, and classified by organism, it would be the metazooplankton. Macroplankton, which is 2 to 20 cm, which is the metazooplankton. The mesoplankton, which is 0.2 to 20 millimeters, which is the protozooplankton. Microplankton, which is 20 to 200 micrometers, which is the phytoplankton. Nanoplankton, which is 2 to 20 micrometers, which is the mycoplankton. Phytoplankton, which is 0.2 to 2 micrometers, is the bacterioplankton. And lastly, the femtoplankton, which is less than 0.2 micrometers, which is the viroplankton. So there's also the classification based on habitat in water body. There is the hypoplankton, which is the benthic, the epiplankton, which is the surface where we can locate the phytoplanktons, bathyplankton, which is the aphotic zone, and lastly, the mesoplankton, which is the Leiden zone. I will now be passing on to Nerisse.
So here is an example of the phytoplankton food web. From left to right, we have the phytoplankton being the producer, the zooplanktons being a primary consumer, the various small fishes, secondary consumer, and the mackerel, tuna, and large fish being the tertiary consumer, and the bacteria, the decomposer. So the phytoplanktons came into existence by sunlight. These organisms are preyed upon by the zooplanktons. Here we have the small fishes consuming the zooplanktons. The mackerel consumes the small fishes, and the tuna consumes both the mackerel and the small fishes. And then we have the large fish, shark, that consumes the mackerel and the tuna. So when this food web is in effect, remains from these organisms consumed will be taken over by the bacteria, which are the ocean's decomposers. The decomposers will release nutrients that will be recycled into the ocean and then supplied to the phytoplanktons. Next. Here, Mr. Terrell will explain more on the phytoplankton food web.
It is important for both abiotic factors and biotic factors in the planktonic environment because they directly affect how organisms survive. Planktons are well adapted to their environment. However, there are still abiotic factors that influence these organisms, like temperature. Temperature can result in warming and acidification of the ocean surface. Nutrients, organisms. Well, before nutrients, these organisms must cope with multiple changes, which can be like a shorter ice season or a later freeze, which can affect their productivity and the blooms as well. Nutrients is another factor. The concentration of plankton are unevenly distributed in the oceans, and this plays a very important role in that. It influences the abundance of the plankton communities itself, nutrients like nitrate and phosphate, and it also influences their growth rate as well. The increasing levels of these can cause levels of pollution and eutrophication, which can lead to blooms and will eventually lead to die-offs of these plankton. Another factor, well, the main factor, biotic factor, is the zooplankton. The zooplankton can obviously, well, they feed on the phytoplankton and actually control the population of the phyto itself. And this is the main biotic factor that influences these organisms. Sunlight is another abiotic factor as well. Reason being, these organisms are plants and sunlight affects their growth rates, and the sunlight is needed for photosynthesis. If sunlight is less than the required amount, then the phytoplankton population will eventually decrease. Next slide. Carrying capacity depends heavily on the abiotic and biotic factors mentioned earlier. Reason being, they have the ability to decrease or, well, the ability to increase or lower the amount present, like mentioned before. If there is too many nutrients available, the phytoplankton may grow out of control. Therefore, the area cannot sustain the growth of new phyto and reach its carrying capacity. On the other hand, if there would have been an increase in zooplankton and the zooplankton would happen to stay in that area because of the increase, then the zooplankton will eventually turn carnivorous and feed on themselves, their own species, and eventually die. So, and that area will basically won't be able to sustain itself after a while. So it won't be, so the carrying capacity will not support the preservation of that ecosystem.
Human impacts. Plastic pollution causes deoxygenation. Plastic blocks sunlight from getting to the phytoplankton, which prevents the organisms from being able to photosynthesize and thereby oxygenate the ocean. Organisms produce oxygen as a byproduct of photosynthesis. Without sunlight, planktons die, causing suffocation and deoxygenation of the ocean. In the two pictures, the whale and the phytoplanktons are dying because they are blocked from sunlight and also consuming the garbage and microplastics. This affects a food web because other species depend on sea creatures and the phytoplanktons to feed on. Biodiversity is affected by the ingestion, suffocation, damage to their habitats, and entanglement of hundreds of marine species, which can lead to death. Humans can get sick as new diseases can be created as we consume these sea creatures due to the garbage inside their bodies. Solutions to these impacts: recycle properly, participate in a beach or river cleanup, avoid products containing microbeads, support organizations addressing plastic pollution, and educating others. Next slide. Eutrophication causing phytoplankton blooms. The addition of nitrogen and phosphorus from fertilizers into bodies of water causes phytoplankton populations to bloom in a process called eutrophication. Agriculture, waste deposition, water treatment, and pollution from factories are three human impacts causing blooming. As the phytoplankton rapidly increase, they deplete oxygen. As a result, the phytoplankton die, sinking to the bottom to decompose. As algae bloom, it may cause the oxygen to remove from the water, leaving none for marine life. Blooms of algae may also block sunlight from photosynthetic marine plants on their water surface. This can lead to a dead zone of many aquatic organisms, such as fish and phytoplanktons, due to the suffocation and the lack of oxygen to live. How is the ecosystem impacted? Some algae produces toxins that threaten the health of aquatic humans, pets, or livestock that use affected water for drinking or recreation. How is biodiversity affected? Algae blooms can reduce the ability of aquatic life to find food and can cause lots of populations to leave area or even die due to the nutrient pollution that causes harmful algae to bloom. Solutions: reducing the source of nutrients, sewage treatment, and limiting supplies of sunlight or nutrients can slow or stop the cell division, preventing bloom formation. Implementations of riparian buffers, which are areas along the rivers that are left to be trees, nature, instead of being cut down for other uses. Next slide. Carbon emissions causing ocean acidification. In the first image, it shows factory emitting carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Ocean acidification is mainly caused by carbon dioxide gas in the atmosphere dissolving into the ocean. This leads to a lowering of the water's pH, making the ocean more acidic. Ocean acidification is paired up with other climate impacts like warming waters, deoxygenation, melting ice, and coastal erosion, as these pose real threats to the survival of many marine species. In the second image, it shows an organism's shell made from calcium carbonate to dissolve due to the ocean acidification. This animal that produces calcium carbonate structure has to spend extra energy either repairing its damaged shell or taking it to survive. How is phytoplankton impacted? According to plant experts, studies have shown that more acidic water makes it difficult for phytoplanktons to absorb nutrients, as pH may play a significant role in limiting the rate of primary production, growth, total abundance of phytoplankton. How does ocean acidification affect human life? As fisheries decline, it will affect the food web we eat, since most of our shellfish requires calcium carbonate to form their shells. Also, the presence of healthy corals reef is imperative to our survival because we rely on them for food, coastal protection, medicines, and tourism dollars. Solution: minimize driving, plant more trees to act on climate change, implementing solutions to dramatically reduce the use of fossil fuels, create booklets and commercials about the importance of marine life and why we should protect them from ocean acidification. Next slide. Graph showing an increase in microplastic. One of the crucial findings of this study is that the change in microplastic abundance over time increases systematically while there is a decrease in marine life. As many of the world's mega sites are located near the coastlines, adjacent coastal waters are often elevated in marine plastics abundance, which in return impacted fisheries and seafood safety. If we aren't committed to find solutions, then there will be more plastic in the ocean than fish years to come. This affects water quality due to the chemicals from these plastics that sea animals eat that may cause food chain to spread sicknesses. All of this may cause because of our selfishness of littering or dumping of garbage in bodies of water without proper treatment or disposal. I now pass it on to Narisi.
So to conclude with this presentation, first, we must remember that phytoplanktons are the foundation of the ocean food web. They are microalgae of the ocean that are quite alike to terrestrial plants, meaning that they possess chlorophyll and need sunlight to grow and survive. Not only that, but they are also like plants. They produce approximately 50% of the ocean's oxygen and oceanic species through photosynthesis. They are extremely diverse, varying from photosynthesizing bacteria, cyanobacteria, to plant-like diatoms, and to armor-plated coccolithophores, and can be classified by their size, habitat, and their taxonomic classification. They are the primary producers. They feed marine animals throughout the trophic levels. Abiotic and biotic factors influence these organisms in a food chain as well as its carrying capacity. It does that by changes in water clarity, the nutrient content, temperature, and salinity, which alters the species population. Human impact plays a big factor on the survival and the decrease of these organisms. In this presentation, we discuss three impacts: the plastic pollution causing deoxygenation, the eutrophication causing phytoplankton blooms, as well as carbon emission causing acidification. So we believe by controlling our plastic, farming chemicals, as well as our carbon footprints, we will minimize the negative impacts on our marine life. Thank you very much.